Is anybody else on?
Yeah, they're starting to come on. There's 5 people. Eddie Cohen, Paul, Brian Bigman, Gary Lickham, Doug.
Okay.
Alan Mall.
Gentlemen.
Good morning. Good morning. How are you?
Ready for Shabbos, I think.
The week goes by very quickly for me these days. There don't seem to be enough hours in the day.
Yep. Well, summers usually go faster than winters, I think.
That's probably
Maybe not in California.
Okay. I'd like to continue along this mitzvah of Tochacha so that we understand clearly when we do and when we do not have an obligation to rebuke others and to tell them that they're doing the wrong thing. This is a very pertinent issue. It's a very timely issue. And it's really something that applies to all of our lives. We had seen the Shulchan Aruch yesterday in the laws of Yom Kippur that the Shulchan Aruch had said that there are certain practices that are not explicitly recorded in the Torah, even though it may be a deoraisa law. And by that we mean it's biblically derived, right? But if it's not explicit in the Torah, and there's a widespread disregard of that mitzvah, you are sometimes better off not bringing it to the attention of a person if you assess in advance that they're not going to listen to you. But all of that is said when something is non-explicit. But if it's explicit, it's known as clear as day that Jews don't eat pork, or whatever the situation may be. It seems quite clear from the language of the Shulchan Aruch that you're obligated to rebuke that person. And the Ramah therefore expands it. He says, "V'hu hadin b'chol devar isur amrinan mutav shiyu shogigin v'lo yiyu nezidin." There's a general principle that's recorded in the Gemara that it is better for them to be unintentional sinners than intentional sinners, because by you educating them, they're going and if they're going to continue doing it, you've actually worsened the situation. B'davka she'enu mefurish b'Torah, but that's only if it's non-explicit in the Torah. Afal pi shehu d'oraisa, even though it may be a biblical law, like adding a little bit of the weekday onto Yom Kippur, adding a little bit of the 9th of Tishrei onto the 10th of Tishrei. Aval im mefurish b'Torah, mochen b'yavin. But if it's something that's explicit, you do have to protest. V'im yodeya she'en dvarav nishmayin, and if you still know that the person's not going to listen to you, lo yomar barabim lahochichan rak pam echas, then you should not publicly admonish the person more than once. In other words, just admonish them once. Aval lo yarbe b'tochachos me'achar she'yodeya shelo yishmu elav, but don't say it more than once because you know they're not going to listen. Aval biyachid, but when in private with that individual and that person's continuing to eat pork in your presence, chayiv lahochicho ad sheyakenu o yikalolenu. You have to continue rebuking that person until they strike you or curse you. In other words, I've had enough of this already. Now, it seems to be it places a tremendous burden upon an Orthodox Jew who is in the presence of other Jews who are not observing the Torah to speak up. And we know that that's not our practice today in many instances, if not in most instances. And so we're first going to finish the Mishnah Berurah that we started yesterday. We'll see a little bit of the Biur Halacha. And then I want to see another source, a contemporary 20th century source, in addition to the Mishnah Berurah, which is the Chazon Ish, Rav Karelitz, who died in the 1950s, and really was the founder of the contemporary Bnei Brak community today. So first, let's finish the Mishnah Berurah. You should only rebuke them once if it's in public, if it's a mitzvah deoraisa that's explicit that they're violating. Ulai yishma'u, because perhaps they will listen. O kedei shelo yihye lahem pischon peh, or so that they shouldn't have an opportunity to say, I didn't know. Umikan va'elach, Kishem shemitzvah lomar davar hanishma, kach mitzvah shelo lomar davar she'eno nishma. But from that point forward, the Mishnah Berurah here is quoting from the Gemara. Just like it's a mitzvah to say something that is heard, it is also a mitzvah to not say something which will not be heard. Right? Once again, just like it's a mitzvah to say something that will be accepted, it's also a mitzvah to not say something which will not be accepted. But at least that one time you do have to say it. Chayev lahochicho, you're obligated to rebuke him. Ba'avera shebeseser, yochichenu beseser, uva'avera shebegolo yochichenu miyad shelo yischal al shem shemaim. And the Mishnah Berurah tells us that the general rule is that if a person is committing a sin privately, you have to rebuke them privately. If they are committing a sin publicly, then you have to immediately disregard the public spectacle that you may be creating and tell the person, how can you do this? This is against the Torah, so that you avoid a chilul Hashem. Because for you to just stand there and not say anything when a person is flagrantly violating the Torah, will cause a tremendous chilul Hashem. Now, let me just point out that I gave you an example that's quite clear, right? A person is eating a bacon, double bacon cheeseburger, right? And so it's quite clear that they're violating the Torah. But there's so many other instances. What about the fact that a guy is walking to his car on Shabbos? He's your neighbor, and he's walking to his car on Shabbos, and he says, "Hey, good Shabbos, how are you?" And then he gets into his car and he drives away. Well, I should probably go over to him and rap on his window and say, "Bob, what are you doing? It's Shabbos today. Okay, how can you drive on Shabbos? You're not supposed to do that. Don't you know it's against the Torah?" And he says, yeah, thanks a lot. Have a nice day. And no, you got to stop him. Stand in front of his car so that he can't get out of his driveway because you have this mitzvah of tochacha. How can you allow this person to violate the Torah? And it seems like and you have to stop until he gets out of his car and starts cursing you out for not getting out of the way, or even if he to the point where he's ready to strike you. V'yesh omrim, the Mishnah Berurah says, until he curses you, D'dai ad sheyinzof bo hachote, u'mikan va'elach asur lahochicha. It is enough that he gets angry with you. But from that point onwards, you're not allowed to rebuke him, according to this opinion. And the Mishnah Berurah, in his footnotes in the Sharat Tziyun, concurs with this, okay? But once he gets angry, you're not allowed to rebuke him any further. Shenamar al tochach leitz pen yisnaecha. As the pasuk says, do not rebuke the scoffer, lest he come to hate you. So if it comes to enmity, if it comes to malice, it comes to anger, so then at that point you have to stop. Okay. So, but still, I got to at least try one time, right? Okay. So that seems to be the Mishnah Berurah. We're just going to look at the Bir Halacha, who actually modifies it further. The Bir Halacha says, Vida. I'm just jumping into the middle of the Bir Halacha. De mistavra de mashapasa karama, de bedavar hamafurish b'torah chayv limchos. He says, what makes sense is that when the Ramah says that when a person is violating an explicit, oh, by the way, let me just jump in 1 second. So we talked about the double bacon cheeseburger. We talked about driving on Shabbos. What about a guy who starts flagrantly speaking Lashon Hara in the middle of a chevra? And we all know that Lashon Hara is an explicit biblical prohibition. So what are you going to do in that case? And he comes to shul on Shabbos. He's Shomer Shabbos, Shomer Kashrus. What do you do in that situation? Okay, so I just want you to think about all those three illustrations. Okay. Vida de mistavra de mashapasa karama de bedavar hamafurish b'torah chayv limchos davka shehu ba'kroi. He says, when we say that when a person is violating an explicit prohibition in the Torah, that there is an obligation to protest, that's only when the person is doing it in a happenstance fashion. Like it just, it's not like this guy is in the habit of eating double bacon cheeseburgers. It's not that he doesn't lead a kosher lifestyle. He normally is kosher, but now he's decided to succumb to his temptation. Right there, you have a mitzvah to rebuke him. Avol elu haporke ol legamre kegon mechalo Shabbos beferhesia o ochel nevelos lahachis. But the Mishnah Berurah then says, but what about people who thrust off the yoke of heaven off of them completely? A public Shabbos violator, or a person who eats non-kosher food for no reason other than he just doesn't care. Or lahachis means he means to actually anger, to provoke God or the Jewish community. Kvar yatsa michlal amisecha. That person has already departed from being a fellow man, a fellow Jew, ve'eno mechuyev lahochicha, and you're no longer obligated to give him rebuke. Now, this is quite shocking when you compare it to what we learned in the Imrei Yaakov. Just the language of the Rav Shulchan Aruch that we learned, let me just bring it up again, had told us that you don't have to worry about onoas devarim when a person is flagrantly violating the Torah, because onoas devarim is only something that you have to be, of hurting someone's feelings, is when they're bichlal amisecha, is when they're being part of your, he's a fellow countryman, he's a fellow Jew. But once he starts sinning and violating the Torah, even rabbinic law, then he's no longer amisecha, and therefore you're allowed to publicly shame him, right? Hold on a second. Oh, I just upgraded my Windows, and now it's got some new features that make life easier for me. Hold on a second. You know, when the computer makes life easier for you and then ends up making it harder for you? Okay. So let me just go back to share the Imrei Yaakov once again. So the Imrei Yaakov had said that there's a mitzvah of tochacha, of hocheach tochiach esamisecha, but so you have to rebuke him, but you have to do it privately, he said, because the Torah says, velo tisa alav chet, you're not allowed to endure or incur a sin in the process of doing this mitzvah. The sin would be you're not allowed to embarrass him. However, v'im lo chazer bo b'seiser machlimin oso b'rabim. The Rav Shulchan Aruch says, but if a person does not heed your rebuke and they continue doing the sin, you're even allowed to shame them publicly. Umakalin oso ve'esyoladav bifanav, and you're allowed to curse both him and his ancestry to his face, ad shiachzer lemutav, until he does tshuva. V'chein kol ha'over al divrei chachamim, even if he only violates rabbinic law, v'lo chazer bo b'tshuva, mutar likroso avrayin, you can call him a sinner. Ve'ein bo mishum onoas devarim, and there's no prohibition of onoas devarim. Why? Shenemar lo sanu ish es amiso, because it says you shall not oppress or harm your fellow. And pirshu chachamim amiso am she'itcha b'torah v'mitzvahs hizira Torah l'ana'asa. The Torah only obligates me to not hurt the feelings of someone who is observing mitzvahs as I am, v'lo ha'over aleihem, and not someone who violates the mitzvahs, who doesn't respond to rebuke, and therefore you can call him even a Rasha ben Rasha, etc. Okay, so the Rav Shulchan Aruch seems to say that you're allowed to publicly shame someone, even when there's going to be onoas devarim, because that person is no longer part of Amisecha. The Mishnah Berurah says, just like the laws of onoas devarim no longer apply to him, the laws of tochacha no longer apply to him. So if the laws of tochacha no longer apply to him, what's the point of shaming him publicly? So we have to conclude that there's not a contradiction here between the Rav Shulchan Aruch in Choshen Mishpat and the Mishnah Berurah in Yoredeya. They actually complement each other. Not only is there no longer a mitzvah of onas devarim, so there's nothing wrong with insulting someone and hurting their feelings when they're violating the Torah, but there's also no longer a mitzvah of tochacha. And if there's no longer a mitzvah of tochacha, you're not obligated to rebuke them. So why would you insult this guy? Why would you shame him and publicly call him out if there's no longer a mitzvah of tochacha? So the answer is, so let me just finish the language here and I'll answer the question. So he says, if he's a flagrant violator of the entire Torah, you have no obligation of a l'rasha shusonecha inatachayv lahochiachosa. An evil person who's your enemy, there's no obligation to rebuke him. And what about a person who eats treif, not because he's a flagrant violator, but because he happens to like double bacon cheeseburgers, or he violates Shabbos, but he doesn't do it publicly and flagrantly. He does it, he parks his car a few blocks away from the shul to come to shul, right? So he's not a flagrant violator, but it's just something that he does because he loves to daven with the Jewish community, and he wants to be a part of it, but he lives too far. So, yesh la'ayin badavar. We have to think about this. We have to examine this more carefully. Is there still a mitzvah of tochacha? And is he bichlal amisecha? Is he called my fellow countryman still? But just to answer the apparent contradiction, once there's no longer a mitzvah of onas devarim, that I have to be careful not to hurt his feelings, there also is no longer a mitzvah of tochacha. And once there's no longer a mitzvah of tochacha, I'm not obligated to rebuke such a person. But what the Rav Shulchan Aruch is talking about is not the mitzvah of tochacha. What he's talking about is that if I feel I can accomplish something positive by publicly humiliating a person whose behavior is antithetical to the Jewish community, I'm permitted to do so and I'm obligated to do so, not because of the mitzvah of tochacha, but rather so that others should not learn from him. That's different from the mitzvah of tochacha. Okay? If I perceive that I can accomplish something on behalf of the Jewish community by telling this person off publicly so that people realize that he's a bad guy and people shouldn't learn from him, so then it's okay. So let me just make a note of this in my own book. All right. So now what I wanted to do with you, let us go a little bit further and just finish off the beer halacha. Mochin biyadim, we have to protest if someone's flagrantly violating an explicit prohibition. Ayin b'Birkei Yosef shemitzadi lomar b'zeh davar chadash. The Birkei Yosef commentary, I believe it's from the 18th century. He says that tells us a new thing. Da'ad kan lo amrinan de bedavar hamafurish b'Torah tzarich limchos af sheyodei sheli yikablum hanu rak k'sheyadenu takifa al ha'ovrim limchos b'hem b'cheskas hayad. He says that the only time that there's an obligation to rebuke sinners is only when we have the advantage, when we have we're on our own turf, and the majority of people are observing of the Torah, and this guy is a poretz getter. In other words, he's in the small minority of people, but that the vast majority of the people in our community are law-abiding, halacha-abiding citizens. But when we don't have the ability to prevent them from sinning, because there's a sense of lawlessness and it's a free democracy and anyone can do what they want, we there's no longer a mitzvah to rebuke them if you know they're not going to accept your rebuke. In other words, it's one thing to say to a person where you feel that your words will be met with seriousness because you have the ability to back it up. Listen, my friend, if you continue doing this, our shtetl has only 50 families. If you continue doing this, you won't be able to join the weekly bingo or whatever it is. But that's where there's a mitzvah to rebuke the person. But if you already know that you live in a metropolitan democratic society, and everyone can do whatever they want, it's a free country, right? So then, even when he's flagrantly violating an explicit biblical prohibition, there's no longer a mitzvah to protest. But the Smak says not that way. The Smak seems to be saying that you won't necessarily be punished for the sins that are committed by your fellow countrymen when you have no control over them. But nonetheless, there's still a mitzvah of tochacha, still a mitzvah to tell someone that what they're doing is wrong, even when you know they're not going to listen, and even when it's in a free society. Another dispensation, quoting from the Sefer Chasidim from the 12th century, he says, Davka ishes achiv shalibo gaspo. He says, the only time that there's a mitzvah to give rebuke is if you know someone, you know each other, you already have a relationship with him. Aval im haya ish acher shem yochichenu yisnaenu v'yinkom yimenu ein lo hochicha. But if it's a stranger, where there's no relationship, and if you start going over to him out of the blue and start rebuking him, he's going to hate you and he's going to try to take actual reprisals against you. So then there's no longer a mitzvah of tochacha. And la'olam yader adam b'makom rabo kishamekabel tochachto the omarlei the imlav al yader the omarlei al yader mutav shiyu shogigim. So one second. La'olam yader adam b'makom rabo, that a person should always live in a place where he has a Rebbe present. Vimlav al yadur, and he should not live in a place where he has no Rebbe. I'm not sure what this last statement means of the Magen Avram. I'm not sure I understand it. I'll try and figure it out later on. And then finally, you have to rebuke him until he strikes you. And then he quotes from the Sefer HaChinuch. He doesn't literally mean until the point where he starts hitting you, but rather, ad she'ei karav achote lahakos asamochiach. You're getting such a rise out of him that it's getting close to that. It's not that you have to actually endure a physical strike, but it's got to get close to that point, and then you can stop. So we've seen a couple of dispensations already. So some holes in this mitzvah. Number one, we saw that if you already know that they're not going to listen to you, so then you only rebuke them once publicly, and then privately you have to continue rebuking them. But if it's someone that already doesn't like you and you don't have a relationship with, so then it seems like there's much more reason to be lenient. And also there's no mitzvah of tochach if a person is no longer amisecha. And that's another thing that we saw. And also the Birkei Yosef seems to say that there's no longer a mitzvah of tochacha if it's in a free society where everyone just does what they want and there's no sense of communal standards as far as how Jews are supposed to behave. The last thing that I want to show you is from the Chazon Ish. And the Chazon Ish is basing himself on a Gemara in Maseches Erechim, and it's an important piece of Gemara. Now, we'll just learn the Gemara quickly. Minayin l'roa b'chavero davar miguneh shechayev lahochicha. How do you know that if you see something, your brother doing something or your friend doing something unseemly, that you have to rebuke him. Shenemar, hocheach tochiach, the Torah says you shall surely rebuke. Hochicho v'lo kibel minayin she'achzor b'yochichenu. If the fellow does not accept your rebuke, how do you know that there's a mitzvah to repeat the rebuke until he does? Talmud lomar tochiach mikol makom. That's the double language of hocheach tochiach. You have to repeatedly rebuke him until he finally accepts. Yachal afilu mishtanim panav. You might think that this is true even if you end up embarrassing him in the process. Talmud lomar lo sisa alav chet. And from there we learn, the Torah says, you shall not incur a sin in the course of this mitzvah. And then Tanya Amar Rabbi Tarfon Tama Ani im yesh bador hazeh shemekabel tochacha. Rabbi Tarfon says, I would be amazed if there's even one person in this generation who knows how to accept criticism, who knows how to accept rebuke. Because usually what happens, and this is going back thousands of years now, Im Amar lo tul kisa mi bein shinecha, Amar lo tul kora mi bein einecha. If someone says, please remove that splinter from your teeth, he will respond, well, I'll do that after you remove the big beam in between your eyes. Now, what that is, that's an old phrase. And what essentially it means is, who are you to tell me that I'm doing something wrong? Look at you, what you're doing is far worse. I've had that happen to me, right? When I tried to point out to someone that they were doing something wrong. It's happened to me more than once, even from congregants. I had a congregant a few years ago where I told the person that they were speaking Lashon Hara on social media against the shul. They had posted something negative. I usually don't criticize people when they stuff they post on social media, except if it's against the shul itself. If someone posts something negative about the shul, that's where I draw the line. And so I immediately sent an email to the person saying, I'm sorry, but this really is not acceptable. And that person wrote back to me without even saying what I was, my flaws. I'm shocked that you would even bring this to my attention based on all of your bad behavior. And I asked them to elaborate, but they wouldn't. So in any event, this happens. This has happened for since the times of the Talmud. You try to tell someone that they're doing something wrong, and their response is, "Who are you to tell me? Look at the beam that's in between your eyes. So you're even worse than I am." So Amar Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, and then Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says something equally important, which is Timihani im yesh bador hazeh sheyodea lahochiach. He says, I would be amazed if you could find someone in our generation who knows how to properly rebuke. Now, what does that mean? What that means is something far more important, which is that no one in the times of even the Gemara, according to Rebbe Elazar ben Azariah, who's a Tana, lives in the times of the Mishnah, knew how to properly critique someone without incurring a sin. Because it takes a particular skill to be able to rebuke someone. Let me see if Rashi says anything over here. Just give me 1 second. Right. Rashi says, Sheyodea lahuchiach derech kavod, in a respectful manner, shelo yehu panav mishtanim, to do it in such a way that the person will not be embarrassed or will not feel bad after you speak to them. Because remember, the Torah says, "Hochiach tochichas amisecha," you shall surely rebuke your fellow, v'lo tisa alav chet, and do not incur a sin in the process. What Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says, there are very few people in my generation that know how to do this, that can actually fulfill that mitzvah without violating the second part of the pasuk. And what that essentially means, it's sort of like the start of a dispensation that we're going to see when we learn the Chazon Ish, which is if in the times of the Gemara they didn't know how to rebuke, then surely today we don't know how to rebuke. And if today we don't know how to rebuke, then maybe we're off the hook from doing this mitzvah because we're probably predestined to botch it anytime we try. And you put that together with the fact that most people today who violate the Torah are doing so out of ignorance, not out of malice, and out of a lack of education. You know, the concept of tinok shenishba, the person is but a babe who was kidnapped as a youth and really never grew up with the proper education of knowing what they're supposed to do and what they're not supposed to do. When you put those together, we'll see, we'll have to save the Chazon Ish for next week, for Monday, but it's an important piece, and I want us to look at it together. Okay, so I want to wish you, with that, I want to wish you a good Shabbos. Any good and welfare?
Wondering, Rabbi, whether one could accomplish this by living by good example and just hope for the best.
Yeah, I mean, that's essentially what we've resigned ourselves to today. I think that the value of this exercise of going through the sources is to point out that there are circumstances in life when that will not be sufficient, Paul. In other words, while we're going to end up very severely limiting the times when I have a mitzvah to rebuke or reproach someone else for their behavior, one should not think that, well, I'll just live a good life and I'll teach by example in all situations. You know, if your son-in-law is doing something inappropriate, I would tell you, keep your mouth shut. If mother-in-law is doing something
For
inappropriate,
sure.
I would tell you, boy, you better keep your mouth shut. If your neighbor who's not Shomer Shabbos is violating Shabbos, I would tell you to keep your mouth shut. But with all that said, and I think Ron, you had raised the question of relatives, right? It depends. We're going to have to. I want us to finish with the Chazon Ish. You'll see the language that he uses, and that his language is also a game changer. But all in all, we're very severely limited. But let's remember that there still is a mitzvah of tochacha. So when you're in shul and you see a group of guys getting together and they're speaking lashon hara about the rabbi,
We'll come to your defense, Rabbi.
yeah. So remember, there still is a mitzvah of tochacha. All right. Anyway, I wish you
Thank
a
you so
good Shabbos, everyone.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbos, gentlemen.
Shabbos.
Be well. Thank you.